Imagine this: a crowded courtroom, tension hanging thick in the air as everyone waits for the case to unfold. A young woman steps forward, poised and confident, ready to present her case. But there's a catch: she's not just any ordinary woman. Little does the policeman standing at the front of the room know, the girl he's about to mock is the most powerful figure in the country's police force. She is none other than the Inspector General of the Federal Police. As the policeman makes his remarks, the room falls into an uneasy silence. He's making light of her, believing her to be just another civilian, unaware of the truth behind her calm demeanor. What happens next will shock everyone in that courtroom. The girl isn't just a victim in this case, she's about to teach a hard lesson in respect and authority. But here's a twist: no one, not even the policeman, could have predicted the revelation that would come next. Will he realize his mistake in time? Or will his mocking attitude lead to even bigger consequences? Stick around, because this story is far from over, and what happens next will leave you speechless. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Everyone's eyes were on the policeman as he stood there, smug and self-assured, with a sneer plastered across his face. His comments about the young woman seemed harmless enough to him, perhaps even a way to break the silence. He didn't realize that by mocking her, he was crossing a line that should never be crossed. The girl, dressed in a simple yet elegant suit, remained calm, not reacting to his taunts. She had dealt with worse in her years of service, but today was different. Today, she wasn't just a low-ranking officer or a random civilian. She was the Inspector General of the Federal Police, the highest-ranking officer in the country's law enforcement. Her position was powerful, and her reputation well known. But for now, she had chosen to remain silent, observing everything with quiet intensity. The case she had come to attend was crucial, one that could change the course of the investigation into police corruption. Her role in this case wasn't just to provide evidence, but to ensure that justice prevailed, no matter what. However, as the policeman continued with his mocking remarks, it became clear that he was unaware of who she truly was. Around the room, the few who recognized her shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The young woman's presence was unassuming, and she had intentionally chosen to blend in. It wasn't until the room's murmurings grew louder that the policeman finally noticed something unusual. A few whispers filled the air. "That's her, the Inspector General, no way." The realization hit him like a freight train. He froze, his eyes widening in disbelief. The smugness drained from his face, replaced by an expression of fear and regret. But was it too late to take back his words? Or had he already crossed a line that would cost him far more than his pride backslash? The courtroom fell into a strange kind of silence as the policeman stood frozen, his face pale. He glanced around, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. The whispers in the room grew louder, and the young woman, the Inspector General, could feel the eyes of everyone on her now. She didn't move, not an inch. Her expression was calm, but inside, a storm was brewing. The policeman's sudden realization didn't faze her as much as it should have. She had grown used to this kind of ignorance in her career. People underestimated her all the time. They saw a young woman, maybe a little too soft-spoken, too composed for their liking. They didn't see the years of struggle and sacrifice that had shaped her into the leader she was today. She had worked tirelessly to get to this position, facing challenges that most could never imagine. But it was never about her ego. It was about making real changes, exposing corruption, and holding people accountable, no matter who they were. As the policeman slowly began to recover from his shock, his colleagues watched from the sidelines, exchanging glances. Some of them had seen this happen before, powerful figures underestimated, ridiculed, only to strike back when it mattered most. But there was more to this situation than just a careless remark. This wasn't just a simple case of disrespect, it was a symptom of a much deeper issue, one that had been festering in the police force for years. The corruption that the Inspector General was fighting to expose wasn't only in the streets. It was embedded within the very institution meant to uphold the law. The policeman's mistake wasn't just about mocking someone who held a higher rank. It was a symbol of the attitude that ran rampant in the department, an attitude that believed power could be used to intimidate and manipulate rather than protect and serve. It was this very culture that the Inspector General had vowed to dismantle. But doing so meant confronting people like this officer, people who had lost sight of the true meaning of justice. For now, the tension in the room was unbearable. The policeman opened his mouth to apologize, but the words never came. He didn't know what to say. Could an apology truly fix the damage done, or had his actions already set something much larger into motion? Outside the courtroom, behind the scenes, forces were already at play, setting the stage for a battle that no one could predict. The room's atmosphere grew heavier with each passing second, and the policeman, now acutely aware of his grave error, shifted uneasily on his feet. He opened his mouth again, but this time no words came. The Inspector General's eyes remained fixed on him, her expression unchanged, but in her mind 1,000 thoughts raced. This was more than just a public humiliation. It was a challenge to everything she had worked for. The other officers in the room, sensing the weight of the moment, exchanged uncertain glances. Some remained frozen, unwilling to intervene. They all knew what the policeman had done. They knew the kind of power the Inspector General wielded, but they also knew how far corruption had spread within their own ranks. She wasn't just challenging a single officer now. She was challenging an entire system that had turned a blind eye to corruption, manipulation, and abuse of power for far too long. Outside the courtroom, whispers spread like wildfire. News of the encounter quickly made its way through the police department, and soon enough, it reached the ears of the very people the Inspector General had been investigating. Powerful figures, some with deep connections, others with a long history of shady dealings, began to realize that the threat to their hidden world was no longer a shadow in the background. It was front and center, and they had no intention of letting it stand. Back in the courtroom, the young woman's silence was deafening. Every eye was trained on her now, waiting for her next move. The policeman, realizing he had lost control of the situation, shifted his gaze toward the judge, who appeared just as stunned. It was clear that the moment had escalated beyond anyone's expectations. The tension in the room seemed to stretch on indefinitely. The Inspector General could feel the weight of her role pressing down on her. It was more than just an apology that was needed here. It was justice, real justice, the kind that cut through the lies, the cover-ups, and the years of complacency that allowed the system to rot from within. But as the silence stretched on, the stakes grew higher. What would she do? Would she let this officer off with a warning, knowing full well it would only embolden the corruption in the force? Or would she make an example of him, exposing the cracks that ran deep in the very institution she had sworn to serve? Her next decision would have consequences far beyond this courtroom. As the silence lingered, the tension in the room seemed to freeze time itself. The policeman's face was red with embarrassment, his hands fidgeting at his sides as he tried to collect himself. Just as the Inspector General took a slow step forward, preparing to make her move, the courtroom doors slammed open with a deafening crash. All heads turned, startled by the unexpected interruption. A man in a dark suit strode into the room, his presence commanding attention. His steps were firm, purposeful, and his cold eyes swept over the crowd, settling on the young woman. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the very air had thickened, suffocating everyone's thoughts. This was not just anyone who had entered the room. This was someone much more powerful than anyone in the room could have anticipated, someone who had ties deep within the department and who controlled much more than what met the eye. The man was none other than a high-ranking official, someone whose influence stretched far beyond local precincts. His arrival was no accident. He had been monitoring the situation, aware of the Inspector General's investigation into the corruption running rampant within the police force. He had no intention of letting her take the department down, not without a fight. "Is everything all right here?" His voice was smooth, dripping with authority as he cast a sharp glance at the policeman who had mocked the Inspector General. There was an underlying threat in his tone, an unspoken message that made the room tense even further. The young woman's heart raced. She knew exactly who this man was, the very person she had been investigating for months. He was a puppet master, the one pulling strings from behind the scenes, orchestrating the chaos within the force. This was no mere interruption. It was a direct challenge to everything she had worked for. Her mind was spinning. The game had just escalated in a way she hadn't anticipated. The officer at the front now stood even straighter, his earlier embarrassment forgotten. It was clear that the new arrival was on his side. A dangerous alliance had just formed before her eyes, one that could undo everything she had planned. And with her every move now under scrutiny, it was uncertain whether she could trust anyone in this room, not even her own team. The stakes were higher than ever, and the clock was ticking. Every second counted. What would she do now, knowing that this wasn't just a battle for justice anymore? It was a battle for control, for survival within an institution that had become a fortress of secrets. The moment of truth was closing in fast. The room was thick with tension, every eye locked on the man who had just entered. The Inspector General's mind raced, piecing together the puzzle of the last few months. This man, this high-ranking official, was at the center of the web she had been desperately trying to untangle. The pieces of the corruption she had been investigating suddenly clicked into place, and it was clear that the battle she was fighting wasn't just within the department. It was against the very system that had allowed power to corrupt everything it touched. The man's icy stare never wavered as he looked at her, and she could feel the weight of his gaze, the unspoken message that he was no longer willing to hide behind the shadows. He was here to assert control, to make sure his grip on the department remained unchallenged. Her investigation had brought her to this moment, to this confrontation, but she had never expected it to be this direct. As the tension in the room escalated, the Inspector General stood tall, her voice finally breaking through the oppressive silence. "You can't stop me," she said, her tone steady but fierce. "This isn't just about you. It's about what you've allowed to happen under your watch. The people will know the truth." For a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then the unexpected happened. The man's icy demeanor faltered. He glanced at the policeman who had mocked her earlier, then back at her, his expression shifting. He wasn't angry, wasn't threatening, he was worried. Before anyone could react, a sharp knock sounded at the door, and two officers walked in. They were followed by a team of investigators from an external agency, something far beyond the internal police department. They weren't here to back her up. They were here to back the Inspector General's investigation, confirming that her findings had already been substantiated by high-level authorities. The department had already been under investigation for weeks, unbeknownst to everyone in the courtroom, and the truth was about to be laid bare for all to see. The room fell silent again, this time in shock. The man who had walked in with such authority now looked like a cornered animal, the power he'd taken for granted slipping through his fingers. But just as it seemed like victory was within reach, the most unexpected twist hit. The lead investigator, who had entered the room with the backup team, stepped forward and removed his sunglasses, revealing his identity. He wasn't just any investigator. He was a key ally to the corrupt officials within the department, a longtime associate of the very man they had all thought was about to fall. A gasp went through the room as the realization set in. What they had thought was a win was only the beginning of something far darker. The Inspector General's heart sank. She had been played. The investigation that had seemed like a win was actually a setup to expose her as the very thing she had been hunting, a pawn in a much larger game. The man she had thought was the enemy was only the tip of the iceberg. Now, the battle for control was just beginning, and she was far from finished. But as the door slammed shut behind her, she realized one thing: this fight had just turned personal. The shock that hit the room was suffocating. The lead investigator, once thought to be an ally, now stood as a stark reminder of how deep the corruption ran. The Inspector General's mind raced, piecing together how she had been manipulated. The very people she thought she was working with had been working against her all along, feeding her false leads, hiding the truth just